Hello, everyone. My name is Becka Oliver. I'm the Executive Director at the Writers League of Texas, and I am so excited to welcome you here tonight for our June 3rd Thursday conversation on debut fiction, the path to publication and beyond. We're so excited to be here with these three authors to talk about not so much the books themselves. We're going to talk about those books a lot when we do our summer book club this summer, but to actually talk about the experience of going from that manuscript to the finished book, and then the experience of everything that sort of happens along the way in that journey. So I'm going to introduce our authors in just one second, and we're going to jump into it. I do want to thank all of you for being here, spending this time with us. I would encourage you to say hello in the chat box, but also please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, because I am not going to be able to keep track of the chat box as easily as I'm going to be able to pull up the Q&A box and ask some questions. We will save time for your questions absolutely at the end, but let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm going to introduce our authors first. Dalia Azim was born in Canada and raised in the United States. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, American Short Fiction, Aperture, Columbia, a Journal of Literature and Art, Glimmer Train, where she received their Short Story Award for New Writers, and Other Voices, among other places. Country of Origin is her first novel. Dalia lives in Austin, Texas with her family and is the manager of special projects at the Blanton Museum of Art. Thank you so much for being here, Dalia. Here we go. Kimberly Garza is the author of the novel The Last Karankawas, published by Henry Holt in August of this year. She's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and the University of North Texas, where she earned a PhD in 2019. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Copper Nickel, Diagram, Creative Nonfiction, Tri-Quarterly, and elsewhere. A native Texan, born in Galveston, raised in Uvalde, she's an assistant professor of creative writing and literature at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Thank you for being here, Kimberly. And then last but not least, Jenny Tingxi Zhang is a Chinese-American writer and author of Four Treasures of the Sky. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Apogee, Ninth Letter, Passages North, The Rumpus, HuffPost, The Cut, Catapult, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from the University of Wyoming and has received support from Kundiman, Tin House, and Vona Voices. She was born in Shengshan, China, and grew up in Austin, Texas, where she currently lives. Thank you so much for being here, Jenny. All right, I'm stopping the share. So here we go. So we are absolutely, well, you know what, first, huge congrats to each of you. Huge congratulations, you know, and this is such a big, it's a big deal. You've each, you know, I know we were talking before we started that we're here to talk about three amazing writers who have debut books that have either just come out recently or one that is about to come out. But I hope that for you, Kim, as you look ahead to August, that you're taking a beat to soak it in and to really relish the moment. And I hope for Dalia and Jenny, who are a couple months out from that publication date, that if at any point tonight we just can return you to that feeling of, oh my gosh, I just published a freaking book, you know? So congratulations. I just want to start with that. And I think I'm sure I speak for everyone who's here and tuning in. Part of the reason that a lot of folks are watching is because they want to follow in your footsteps. They want to do it too. And I hope you all feel that amazing pride and just, you know, obvious achievement in what you've done. So congratulations. So as I mentioned, we have these three wonderful debut novels. We have these three writers who have been so kind to spend this time with us tonight, sharing their own unique experiences. Four Treasures of the Sky was published on April 5th. Tell me if I get these dates wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Country of Origin was published on April 12th. And then The Last Karankawas is going to publish on August 9th. right? So Kim's going to be taking notes this entire time and getting ready. But I do want to mention to folks again that we hope that you'll join us. The authors are going to join us for our summer book club. We're going to talk about Dalia's book on August 8th, Jenny's book on August 15th, and then Kim's book on August 22nd. But for tonight, we're going to dig into craft and story then. For tonight, we're really talking about how these books came to be, the path to publication. So we're going to start at the beginning. That's really kind of like the end of the beginning. The question is, finally, and I'm going to I'll just start alphabetically and then we'll mix it up. But for each of you, when did you know you were done? When did you know that your manuscript that you had worked on for however long you worked on it, when did you know that you were done? And I don't mean completely done, because you're never completely done, right? But you were done enough that you were ready to start exploring the publishing part of it, that the craft part of it, okay, until I start working with some other folks, agent or editor or what have you, but I'm done. This manuscript's ready. It's time. It's time to embark on that. Dalia, how about you?
Thanks, Becca. I think it's a great question. It's a kind of a hard question to answer because I feel like, at least my experience is I wrote many drafts of this book, and each time I get to the end, there is this sort of like euphoric moment of like, oh, I got to the end, it's done, and just like the sense of pride and excitement that I'd reached that sort of milestone. But I would typically put it away for a little while and come back to it and then just start to see a lot of the cracks that I wasn't seeing before. But I did kind of like a really stripped down radical revision at one point in the process where I just really shook it up in terms of like the way I told the story, and just took it from being like these short sections that rotated between characters to like these longer sections where I really kind of dug into a character. And there was something about finishing that draft that felt like, okay, I think I've actually kind of cracked this thing. Like I was putting the pieces together, kind of forcing them together in different moments. But this felt like I'd found the form for the book and for the storytelling that really suited it. And so, yeah, it felt unique in that way, just that like I finally stumbled into a shape that really worked for the story.
So sort of, okay, I've kind of found the shape, what it's meant to be. And now I'm ready to start bringing in the industry folks or other people to kind of help me figure out. Okay. Kimberly, how about you?
Yeah, I think mine was a little, I guess, in terms of when I thought I was done, or, again, thought, because I knew it wasn't going to really be done, but in my mind, it was sort of almost there. And it ended up being nowhere close, was when I was looking at story and voices, and I had run out of things to say. And I had tinkered with them enough that I couldn't really see any further path, although I knew it had to be there. I just got to the point where I had a blind spot, I think, for my own work. And at that point, just because I saw a question for this in the chat, I had spent about maybe like 5 years on it. And it was at the time a collection of stories, and I'd worked on each one over and over. And I had the privilege of coming through graduate school with it. So I was working on it, and it was constantly getting eyes on it from classes and from really trusted readers and professors. And, so I had the luxury of being able to know it wasn't just me looking at it the whole time. It had some eyes. I'd taken some feedback and gone back to each story a couple of times, and to the book as a whole several times after it was finished going through graduate school. And I just got to the point where I couldn't see any further path for it to go, although I knew it had to get there. And that was when I knew, okay, let's let some other minds and other trusted eyes kind of take a look at this.
And when you say that it was a collection of stories, was your intention ever for it to be a story collection, and then it morphed into, or you decided to turn it into a novel, or was it always that your intent to publish a novel?
Yeah, it was at the time, I think my intent was open. Always. I mean, it was to get published, right? Frankly, like to, have somebody read this book. And I think when the initial submission, it was a linked collection. It was always billed as that. I was very intentional about how I crafted each story and wanted them to be part of this cohesive whole. And then the path towards it being closer to something like a novel, because it is still each chapter, it's a novel in stories, really. So the borders are kind of nebulous there, but that came about when I was working with the editor at the publishing house. So
interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I was getting at, whether publishing told you that it was a novel, even though you had presented it as stories.
Right. Yeah. And I never want to be like, they made it be a novel. I mean, I was really open to it, and the links were there, the connections were always there. And by the time I was finished editing it, revising it before it even was submitted to publishing, they were stronger. They were even stronger than when I was originally working on it. So it was literally almost like it was a labeling decision at a certain point, do we call this a linked collection, or do we call this a novel? Who decides where the lines are? Let's call it a novel.
Yeah. Thank you. Jenny, how about you? How did you know I know it's such a terrible way to phrase it, that you were done?
Yeah. So for me, and this is what many of my answers will be, but it was a feeling thing. I went in and I had kind of, nebulous like story points that I wanted to hit. I had emotional points I wanted to hit, and I had character arcs that I wanted to make sure I fulfilled. And once I had that, and I like cried when I wrote the ending. So that was kind of another sign to me that, I had done something that I would be happy with. But I did send it out to beta readers after I finished that first initial draft and got feedback from other people. So I knew, it wasn't just that I was too close to this to see the reality of it. But once I had, 6 other people's opinions and my own, and I reread the draft that I had written, and I felt good about it. Because I think, when we say, oh, I'm done, there's always this voice in the back of your mind that's saying, but there's this one part you need to fix, or, this character is not completely filled out yet. But when I did that draft, I didn't really have any of those voices at the time. So that was how I knew I've taken this as far as I can, just as my own person, and I'm ready for professional feedback now.
Right, because it's not necessarily it's done, it's pristine.
Right.
I've taken it as far as I can take it, but I don't, necessarily think that there's not more work to be done here. It's sort of, I've gotten it to where I can get it for sure. So let me ask you now, I want to just also remind folks that these are like snowflakes in terms of everyone's different. Everyone's got a different experience. Everyone's got a different journey. And sometimes we think there's a very specific path that we all take towards publication, but it is part of why I love this panel is that you're each going to have probably very different sort of perspectives. So I do want to move into, once you say to yourself, okay, I'm ready to start moving down that path to publication. Often the first step is the search for a literary agent, right? So I guess for each of you, and Jenny, we'll start with you and go back. Could you talk about what that looked like for you? Are you currently working with an agent? And if yes, how did that relationship come about? And did you have any twists and turns on the road that you want to share?
Yeah, and also I'm sorry, there's a helicopter noise somewhere in the background. So I feel like my journey is a little bit windy and peculiar because I actually didn't go down the path of querying agents. So my agent, Stephanie Delman, who's amazing, she actually emailed me because she had read some essays I'd written for Catapult, and she was interested. She was interested by the essay, but emailed and asked, "Hey, are you currently working on anything long form? And if so, would you want to send it to me?" So that, and at the time, I never even thought of seeking out agents because I was writing mainly like short nonfiction. And so I wrote about 120 pages and I sent it to her. And, you know, it was just kind of a back and forth. We're in conversation. There's no offer being made, but she gave me some feedback on those 120 pages. I revised, sent it back to her, and she gave me an offer of representation. So she made that offer on a partial. So, you know, kind of it goes along with your earlier question too, Becca, about how did I know it was done? It was also, I had kind of already that agent support carrying me through writing the rest of the novel, knowing that I already kind of have this person. So I kind of believe a little bit more in what I'm working on. But overall, even though I didn't go down that traditional like query letter route, I would urge people who are watching to remember that there are alternative ways to get agents. You know, like they are also out there looking for new writers and new voices and work. And they reach out to people based on the things that they're reading out there. So there are ways outside of just writing query letters.
Yeah, and I think that's a great reminder to writers to be thinking about how to put your work in the world before, to not make the assumption that the first time I'm going to put my work in the world is when I publish a book. That there, you know, if you're interested in shorter form and if that excites you, then going through that submission process can not only be so rewarding and also validating when you have editors, can be great to put on a query letter eventually, but also can be a great way to attract agents too. But that's a moment there to have someone reach out to you and to decide to work with that person without seeing what other opportunities there might be. So just to stick with you for a little bit longer, can you talk about how you made that decision, how you felt like, okay, I haven't really explored other possibilities, but this person said this, or they did this. And it really is clear to me that we're a good, and we're huge fans of Stephanie Dellman's at the Writers League. So I can see why you're so excited to be working with her. But how did you know?
Yes. So I actually got 4 offers of representation off of this partial. I'm sorry, the helicopter is back.
I keep thinking it's a bird.
Oh, okay, that's good.
It's like a lovely chirping sound.
There is also that. That is also.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Yeah. So I actually had 4 offers of representation on this partial, and all 4 of those agents found me through my essays at Catapult. So again, I have to stress how important it is to just put your work out there, because I didn't query any of these agents. So I, even though I didn't do the work of going out and seeking what agents are out there that I might want to work with, I did have kind of a choice and, a comparison and pros and cons to make. So I ended up deciding to go with Stephanie because some of the feedback that she gave me on my initial 120 pages, that altered the course of the book. My book is told from first person perspective. The main character, her name's Dalia, but initially when I wrote it, I had planned on writing it from several people's perspectives. And Stephanie, when she read it, she said, I think you should just stick with this one girl's perspective and take it from there. And when I took that advice and I actually implemented it, it turned into the book that it is today. And I think it's a better book for it. So I chose her because I trusted her editorial feedback, even before she became my agent. And I also think it's really important that you are able to communicate well with your agent. That's also why I went with her, because we had similar communication styles. And I knew if this person is going to be with me for the rest of my life, basically my career, it needs to be someone that I can just pick up the phone and talk to them and not feel any doubt, not feel like she's being untruthful, just feel totally confident in the fact that she wants the best for me in my career.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So Kimberly, how about you? What did you work with an agent? Can you tell us how, if yes, that relationship came about? Did you work with more than one agent, or have you had what has that route been?
Yeah, my route was, I mean, I guess more traditional. I queried. I queried the hell out of agents. And I think for me, I had the opposite perception of Jenny, which is that I knew people who were getting found by agents, based on work that they were publishing, and I was publishing, and that never happened. So I thought I was going the non-traditional route. I was like, I guess I'm just going to query. But I did that work. And it was, I mean, it's a process. It's I asked around friends who'd published. I asked everybody I knew to send me their query letters. I looked online. There's so many amazing resources out there for, emerging writers and people looking to publish. And I rewrote query letters and sent them, and then regretted sending them and sent more. And I did that for, a good couple of months, I think. And I was fortunate, at least in that, as much as and it's very much hit or miss, or it was for me. As much as I was hearing, crickets, or I'd get, a polite rejection, I was also getting interest, like, yes, I'd love that. Send me the whole manuscript. And I did have the manuscript finished at the time. And I'd have people being interested, or people had asked for it and got back to me with encouraging words. Some people, I did get the, I can't sell story collections kind of thing, which at the time I was still billing it as, I only ever queried it as a story collection. I wanted it to be taken on the strength of the piece, and rather than just what I was calling it. And I did end up going with I do have an agent. I did end up going with my agent, who was amazing, Alex Glass, because I was very fortunate in that I used a connection. I had a good friend named Kate McQuaid, and she had published a really lovely linked story collection that I admired so much. And I asked her about her agent, and she highly recommended him. And I sent him my pitch, and I think 2 hours later he wrote me back and wanted to read the whole thing. And I think overnight he read the whole thing, which was amazing. I don't even want to read it overnight. And so he made me an offer really quickly, and I ended up getting 2 other offers from other agents who had also requested to read the whole thing. But I went with Alex. It was pretty much a no-brainer. He was, I think, like Jenny said, our communication was amazing. I sort of need someone who's a little more of a go-getter and a little hungrier than I am, because I have that writer anxiety. And I needed someone who saw the value of my work, and also would be able to tell me, the gaps that I couldn't see, or the blind spots that I had. And someone who was, connected and unafraid to fight for this. And at every step, he has been a total champion for this book. So, and for my work, and I feel very fortunate. But yeah, that was the route I took. So I feel really lucky, but I mean, I did do the work. So I also feel, proud of that. And I hope it's a good story. I know how frustrating and hard it is, especially since COVID, this was all happening. I think I signed with Alex, right at the beginning of COVID, actually. I think it was like February 2020. So, there was a moment where he was saying, like, I can go down to Texas and we could talk about it. And then I think like a week later, it was like, oh, nobody's going anywhere. So I feel really fortunate that happened before the crush of things. But I do have any,
because you did go through the querying process, and it sounds like you sort of, you got a lot of feedback, you got some rejections, you got some yeses, you got probably some crickets, some no sound at all. But do you have any tips for anyone listening as they approach their query letters? It is so different, obviously, from the work of writing fiction. But what advice would you give to yourself if you were going back in time as you're embarking on query letters?
I guess just, I mean, it's hard to give specific advice, because everybody's query letters, even depending on what your book is, right, and who you're pitching it to, it's going to be really varied. I did a lot of research. Like, I read every resource I could find online. I asked for query letters from every writer that I even barely knew, who I thought might send me theirs. But I would say, like, one of the as far as how to write a query letter, I think that there's a lot of different ways you could do it. I think there's a lot of better minds than mine who've talked about this online and in different places. But one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was actually querying was the trickle down, right? Like, why not start kind of towards the top and looking on maybe people who represented big name writers and who I would think were aligned with my work in some way, right? And that sounds very strange. And I think maybe for, writers who are out there kind of wondering what to do with our work and how to talk about it, it feels really weird to say, well, now I'm going to query the agent who represents, Edwidge Danticat. Like, what, in what world, will that work for me? But it's this nice kind of way to look at yourself and to begin to look at yourself as a professional, right? As worthy of being in this field with writers like these people, and many, many others who have done the work and have their books out there. So it was just a sort of a baby step, but it helped later when you get asked, when you're drafting your query letter again and you're asked for your comp titles, right? Like, what books would you compare yours to? Or if readers are fans of X book, they'd really like mine. And just to start to see your own work and yourself as a writer as among other writers, among this world of literature and people putting out good literature, I think that was helpful.
Yeah, I often say to folks, just start figuring out where you live on the bookstore shelf and who are those authors that sit next to you on that shelf. And I think that in Alex T and his autobiography, I'm going to butcher it, Autobiography of a Writer, everyone help me. Anyways, wonderful book. Says that he would go and visit the bookstore shelf where his book would live all the time. Like, just go into the bookstore and be like, this is where my book's going to be, and kind of just visualize it. So anyways.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Jenny. That was good. I was like, how to write my autobiography, how to write an autobiographical
I knew
novel.
I was screwing that. Write an autobiographical novel. Thank you so much. Dalia, how about you? Tell us your journey in terms of post the manuscript's ready to go, the agent experience, the agent search. What has that been for you?
I guess we all kind of say it is a little bit different. So maybe it just shows the variety of experiences that people have in the publishing world. I think related to what I was talking about earlier, and that kind of enthusiasm that I felt with some early drafts. I think I queried too early, but I did find an agent a number of years ago who liked the draft that I was submitting and wanted to work together on revision. Where it kind of went awry, because that's where the story goes, essentially, is like splitting ways with an agent I had for a long time. But she had a lot of feedback, and I would revise, and some of the feedback was really good, but sometimes it didn't really resonate. And I think, really intimidated by the idea of having to go back out there. It's like, breaking up and then having to like be single again and out there dating or something. I think it is kind of an apt metaphor, but so I think I stayed a little bit long, but when I had that unique feeling about my book, where I was like, oh, I think this is it's really it this time. Like, I think there was some sort of unique accomplishment in the way that I'd written it. My agent was just not, I think she'd read it too many times, honestly. She was not that enthusiastic about it, and encouraged me to start a new project. So I decided to split and go my own way. And then actually I had the editor I ended up working with had read a couple of versions of my book. She's based in Austin as well, and just part of the community that a number of us are a part of there. And anyway, she asked if she could publish my book, and I was very eager to take that opportunity and to work with her. And it's been an amazing experience, and not how I expected it would happen at all.
I love that we're talking about this, because that is something that folks wrestle with, right? I think there is an excitement to, I should start querying agents, I should find an agent. And it makes sense, right? There's enthusiasm, whether it's you have a full draft or you're on the second draft, and it's like, that's the next step that's coming, right? But what happens if you start to work with someone early enough that things change over time, right? And you are not alone in this experience. I know a lot of writers who have worked with agents, and for whatever reason, it just ultimately feels like maybe this isn't the right fit. And so, and it's a scary thing to do. Exactly what you just said. It's such a scary thing to do. And I love that folks are hearing that, because it's definitely a part of the experience. And then you are basically, you now have a relationship that is primarily your big relationship is with your editor, right? And so your editor has kind of shepherded you through that, the big editorial piece of it, which we're going to get to, but also is that, you know, a lot of those things that an agent would be. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
So I do want to talk before, because I want to get into the editorial side of things, and I want to get into the experience of when you're in the book, the publishing house, when that starts. But first, I am going to go back to Kim and to Jenny to talk about the submission process with editors, to talk about, you know, were you involved in that? How much or how little did you sort of sit at your agent's side while they were figuring out who to submit to? How much were you in the know as things were coming back to them in terms of, you know, passes or offers? And was there anything that they were expecting you to be doing during that, you know, sort of build up to when the book would be submitted that you would want to share with folks? Meaning, you know, as the writer, you've done the big heavy lifting, you've written the manuscript, you've probably worked with your agent on some editorial work, and now it's going out. Was there any other sort of marching orders about create a website, get on social media, all of those sorts of things? So we're going to talk about that middle space. You have an agent, you're not yet on submission, and kind of what that looks like. I'm going to start with you, Jenny.
Yeah, I think my process was actually quite straightforward. So I mentioned I got the offer off of a partial manuscript. So I just basically went back into my hole and wrote the entire rest of the book. And I didn't show it to my agent until I reached that point that we talked about with your first question, where I was absolutely sure this is as far as I can take it. And so my agent read it, and her feedback was also very light. And she said, I think you're at a point where you don't even need my eyes anymore for this. You know, you need an actual editor to take you to that next level. So she, you know, when I've had that very first call with her and I asked her, and I think this is something that, you know, if y'all are talking to agents, for those of you watching, and you're having these conversations, you should definitely ask them, you know, what publishers or what editors do you see my book going to, or do you think would be a good fit for me and my book? Because they should know, they should have an idea. So on that very first call, she said, I think Carolyn Blakey at Flatiron would be the dream editor for this book. And that was kind of always her number one. And lo and behold, that's who my editor is now for this book. But, you know, getting to that point was, she had one, maybe three top editors that she thought would be perfect fits. And then we ended up sending it out to, I think the list was in the 30s, which I think is that's a pretty big list, right? Yeah. And my agent, you know, I always had input. She asked me, is there anyone you want to add? She would send me the list, you know, was very, open about, hey, if you want more information about any of these people and have questions, you know, you can ask me. So it felt like a very collaborative process. But for me, as someone who's never been in this world before, and this is why I say trusting your agent is so important, I just wanted her to do all of that difficult and businessy work for me, because I trusted that she had my best interest and the book's best interest at heart. So in the end, it went to the person that from the very beginning she felt was the perfect person. And she was right. Carolyn is the perfect editor. But I would say, you know, for those of y'all who are thinking about how do I work with agents during the submission process and with editors, just be upfront with them in that initial exploratory call that you have with them before they even become your agent, where you're asking them, what does your submission process look like? How much input do I have? Are you going to be transparent with me about it? These are the important questions.
Yeah, because even some writers will say, I don't want to know when someone rejects my manuscript. I'm not emotionally prepared to deal with that. And just being upfront and understanding exactly for both of you, right? For both of you, the agent and the author. Kimberly, you were pointing at yourself. Is that a good description for you?
I was very adamant. I think Alex kind of sensed it, but yeah, he was like, well, at any stage, I can let you know when we were submitting. Here's the list. I think similar to Jenny's, I felt very fortunate that he looped me in at every stage of the pre-submission process. When we were revising quite a bit, when he was drafting the list of where he was going to submit. I think it was quite a big list as well. And I think he kept putting me in perspective a bit by saying like and again, this was 2020, so well in the throes of COVID. We ended up having to push our initial submission goal, which had been the summer. We pushed it to the fall because that was just too hectic of a time. I think all of publishing, like everybody else, was kind of figuring out what to do with their lives and how to deal with this different energy. But, we pushed it to the fall. He was showing me his list at every moment, let me know if I had any questions, if I, could think of any others, and also kept reminding me, this could be a long process. This might be first round, right? Here's first round. And second round, here's what we might do. Third round, here's what we might do. So that was helpful too, just to kind of have that in the back of my mind. And I think in terms of the middle space, right, that you were talking about, Becka, my task was to be thinking about my answer to the question of what's your next project, right? Since at the time, this was the story collection, and he was like, you're going to get asked if you have a novel. And even if this ends up becoming a novel, you'll get asked if you have a second novel, right? So the idea of the debut writer, and maybe Dalia and Jenny can speak to this, but like the idea of the debut writer is someone who might be able to carry on a career, right? Somebody who's going to be in it for the long haul. And so he had me thinking about that, right? And that was helpful because I had definitely told him, and he had asked me the question of how much do you want to be kept in the loop when I'm submitting, when people pass, when they do this. And I was like, I don't really want to know, what they say when they say no. You can just move past them. We'll pretend that they didn't, that they weren't on the list, and I'll forget. And I just want to hear about the people who are interested and move on. So he was fantastic about that. And I was very fortunate. We had a good amount of interest. And I think this might've been due to COVID and maybe because I'm a new writer, but we did a couple of Zooms with interested editors. So it became a bit more of, I was definitely involved in that process, right? They wanted to talk to me a bit more about visions for the book.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That opportunity to talk to potential editors and I'm sure Alex gave you some great advice going into that, but what kind of, can you speak to what you think folks listening should think about when they have that opportunity? When there's interest, there are a number of different houses, to more than one person. Obviously, your agent is going to give you a lot of good guidance in terms of comparing the houses and what is possible in terms of the publication experience. But what are you as the writer thinking about, and what would you suggest other people think about in terms of meeting an editor?
Yeah. And this advice I got from my agent, right? So like Jenny said, this was the point where I also just wanted to trust the agent's knowledge and experience. And they would tell me, he told me some things to look for and some things to think about, as well as some writer friends. But I would say in those talks and those discussions, I was looking for an editor. I was listening to the things they were asking me, the things they were saying about, perceptions of my book or questions that they had, or things that really spoke to them, things that they were interested in, things that they might suggest, we would push on. And really, I was just trying to listen for someone who understood my work in the way that I hoped an editor would, right? In a way that I don't think I would have had to fight for with someone who would be editing my work. And I I was listening for that. I heard a lot of good things, but I think the editor I landed on, Ruby Rose Lee at Holt, was the editor. She had insights from the beginning. She had really great questions. She had comments about, she really understood the characters and the themes behind the book and beneath the book. So I knew that no matter what we did, she was going to hang on to those and she was going to really understand them. So that was all sort of processed through me listening in those initial conversations and just really thinking about if I had my choice, who I wanted to work with. And I feel very lucky.
So let's talk about that experience working with an editor, because of course we put it, especially at the stage where you're not, you're finished with the manuscript. We always think, oh, it's the agent-author relationship that is the thing I have to think about. But really, there's such a huge piece of a writer's life is that editor-author relationship. And oftentimes agents take a step back and say, like, I get it. This is going to be your primary person for some things now. And especially, Dalia, I would love to hear, you're working with Jill Myers, who's an amazing editor. And if you're going to know an editor and have conversations that are basically, I want to publish your book, the perfect person to have that with is Jill Myers, because she's brilliant. And to be at A Strange Object and Deep Vellum and the work that they're doing is super cool and exciting. And I'm just wondering how you knew that Jill was the editor for you, how those kind of conversations maybe you two had about the manuscript where you just, you knew that she got it.
Well, I feel like those sparks were earlier than we started talking about having an editorial relationship. It was her having read like a previous draft of my book. And I think maybe it's just my fragile ego, but it's wonderful to have somebody who can tell you both what you're doing right and what needs to, what could be honed and improved upon. Because I feel like that kind of knowledge of like what is really working or what somebody's really latching onto can be sort of a North Star in terms of like helping you through revision. But Jill, she just seemed to get the book from the time that she read it for the first time. And actually that was sort of, I usually have a lot of like negative self-talk in my head, but she was like the positive self-talk when I was struggling a bit with the agent I had and just with the industry of like, well, Jill loves it. And she thought this really worked well. And so having her as sort of a champion over some time before we actually ended up together in this professional relationship with her publishing my book. I knew that she always got it and really saw the vision and wanted, and then when we did start working together I had internalized a lot of her feedback over time, and we made some changes, and she made really wonderful suggestions throughout the process, mostly about sort of tightening and how to kind of get to the story faster at times. But yeah, it was just a very smooth relationship. I feel like we always saw eye to eye, and I just had absolute trust in her editorial viewpoint.
So an editor, wears many hats, right? An editor, I think some of us, maybe have this romantic view of editors that they're in their offices and they have a lot of red pencils and manuscripts spread everywhere, and that's what they do all day long. But the reality is that editors are in marketing meetings. Editors are in editorial meetings. They're in sales meetings. They become your shepherd through the process inside a publishing house, and they are your biggest cheerleader, and they are the one who's going to give you great news and sometimes give you not great news, right? So they're going to be there every step of the way, but they're also often called upon to think about marketing and other things too. So I want to start with the editorial part of it. Someone asked a question that I would love to hear if any of you have an experience that you think would be helpful to folks to hear about. That question of, but if they're your editor, do you have to change? Do you have to make every change they want you to make? What about those things where you don't quite agree with an editorial note as the writer someone's paid for your book, right? You're now being published inside this publishing house. How do you deal with those sticky moments where it's, you have to, maybe push back? Did any of you have that experience? Any disagreements with your editor, or at least, moments where you resisted? Kim, Jenny? Oh no, I couldn't tell from any facial expressions if anyone was
We're all thinking
resisting.
hard. Yeah, I don't think I ever had a moment where I had to push back against my editor, but I think that's because of the nature of the edits that she gave me. They weren't specific. They weren't like, you need to go into this character and you need to make them more this or that. It was all it gave me a lot of freedom to play around and do what I thought I could within the parameters of what my editor was asking for. So that's how she is as an editor. But I found that because she gave me feedback in that way, where there was so much freedom, but I had a clear understanding of what she was asking for, I never had to push back because it was all coming from what I wanted to do and what I thought was right under kind of her direction of, here's where I would like to see it blossom into.
Right. Okay. Oh, that's great. That's a great experience. Kimberly, how about you?
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think I know I pushed back on a few small things, but nothing big. And we did make a few big changes to the book. There were a couple of stories here or there in the original manuscript that we cut, and cutting is awful and I hate it. But I think the great thing about it was that my editor would explain, right? The thinking behind, rather than just saying, this chapter sucks, cut it, Kim. It was like, thinking of, what is this voice doing? What is this chapter doing? Is it being repetitive? Is it actually overshadowing this other chapter where that thought or that kind of voice or that plot is really allowed to sing? And is this distracting from it? I think the really great thing is that I kept being reminded in all these different ways that my editor has I think a bigger view of the book than I had, right? I almost couldn't see the forest for the trees. And that was really helpful. So kind of like what Jenny said, I knew where the edits and the suggestions were coming from. So even when I resisted initially, changing a point of view in a chapter would, be like agony for me. And I had to do it a couple of times. But understanding the thinking behind it really helped, right? The intention, and it was hard to deny. And so there were very small things that I pushed back on. I didn't want to cut certain words or, change up certain sentences or things like that. But for the most part, it was really very, very clear that the edits were the right ones. Yeah, and I wouldn't have done them if they weren't.
There's almost that sort of reference we have. They're an editor, right? Everywhere else in the process, you've had peers reading, you've had, folks who are in a writing group with you, or, agents, what do they know, if they're saying no. But once you get to a point where you're inside that process and you have an editor talking to you, it does feel like, all right, and now I'm with like the professional. I'm going to see what this feedback is. So let's talk about the next step, which is often that you get into a publishing house, your editorial work, of course, is ongoing. You're going through drafts with your editor, but then you reach a point where you're starting to talk about publicity and marketing. So I would love to hear your experience with that side of it, and especially a very different relationship from the other two we've talked about, is the relationship with your publicist or with other people in the sort of sales and promotion side of a publishing house. And so I'm just curious what that has looked like for each of you, and especially if there's any sort of if there was any kind of big lesson that you learned in that whole kind of piece of it, that publicity marketing piece of it, or even just a highlight that might be interesting to folks who are listening in, that was either something you didn't expect to be doing to promote your book, or that you were surprised the publisher was doing. Sometimes you hear about, oh, they're shipping copies to every bookseller with a beautiful, flower attached to it and telling people how lovely the book is. I don't know. But I can see Jenny's thinking. What happened? What was your relationship? What was that like once you sort of were introduced to a publicist, Jenny, and started thinking, putting that hat on that maybe isn't so natural for writers, that marketing and promotion?
Yeah, it's odd, right? Because so much of our work is we do it kind of in a silo alone, and then suddenly we have to go out and be personable and be able to talk about it with our mouths instead of our fingers. It's a tall order. Yeah, so I met my marketing director and publicist about 10 months out from my publication date. So I published in April. I think I met them in June, I think, if the math's right. But primarily over the past 10 months since, it's been a relationship with my publicist. Like, I hear from my publicist more than anyone, especially with tour going on. But I think what was interesting was that, you think about, okay, I'll have interviews to do, whether written or oral, and possible tour stops and like in-person events or via Zoom. But what I was really surprised by, and I'm very grateful for, is that my publicist lined up a lot of kind of, so Flatiron is the imprint of Macmillan. And there were several kind of in-house events that I got to do, such as, kind of like a meet and greet with the entire Macmillan sales team, or Macmillan would do kind of featured authors that are debuting in winter of 2022. And they would kind of introduce them to booksellers and invite booksellers to come and watch and meet the authors. And I could talk about the book and in my own words. So I did maybe 5 or 6 events, before 2022, my publication year, where I just got to practice kind of talking about the book to other people that didn't know anything about it. And I found once I started doing actual like podcast interviews or, like NPR, for example, like all that practice that I had done with these smaller events that my publicist lined up for me, they were what was, I was drawing on that experience to kind of get through these more nerve-wracking events. And also my publicist was always very good about saying, hey, if you want to have a prep call where we just go over, maybe anticipate questions that you'll be asked, if you just want to hop on Zoom and talk at me and we can figure out, your talking points. And if you find something sticky, we can talk through it together. She was always so wonderful about just helping me practice talking. So I think, when you get to the point where you're meeting your publicist and marketing people, it's really kind of, again, as with your editor and your agent, trying to gauge, is this kind of a relationship one that, the communication is good and I feel comfortable. And I also feel like they have my best interests at heart and will help me kind of catapult me to like where I want to be with the book. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny, I'm thinking back to when I worked in publishing, and it used to, pre-Zoom, the way that we do all of these webinars, it used to be that publishers would hire someone to come and media train you. But now that you're able to do this Zoom situation where we can all your publicist can give you some media training before you get out there in the world. That is an important part of the process too, that sort of internal sales part of it. It's the pre-sales. It's before we take you out into the world, we're also going to sell the people who are going to take your book out into the world. We're going to sell you to the libraries that are going to order copies of your book, the booksellers and all of that. Kimberly, how about you? What was that publicity? What has that publicity side of things been like?
I think it's, it's still going on. I'm in the middle of it, right? It's not out yet. And I know I'll have a lot of fun once it's out too. And I think the whole aspect of publicity and marketing is so foreign to me. And it's been a lot of fun to learn some of it. But I'm also hyper aware that I'm like struggling with it. It's like a skill that I didn't have until now. And there's so many and now that I'm kind of noticing it, there's so many writers out there who are so smart about it, and I'm kind of envious. But I think it's just something about having to learn something new after so much of the attention and the effort and the energy has been to making the book as good as I could make it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about it in that way, like, oh, I didn't make a website until like 2 weeks ago, then I don't feel as bad, because I like to remember that I was also spending those years of when I probably should have been updating a website, I was working on the book. So I'd like to think that that's a good thing. And I mean, I just find it really interesting. I do love the aspect of publicity and marketing, which is just the fact that they really target libraries. I think that was something surprising to me, and it shouldn't have been, because how awesome are libraries? Like, we all love libraries. And I think the sort of similar to Jenny, my Holt is an imprint of Macmillan as well. And so they were able to set up a lot of panels and Zooms that I was part of, in which you spoke only to librarians and to independent booksellers who, maybe aren't as privy to some of this information as like some of the big shops would be. And I loved that. I loved getting the fact that I was able to write a letter to booksellers that was going to go out with the advanced copies of the book. And I got to personalize it to the independent booksellers and to the librarians, and to, just to speak to them, one-on-one. I felt very lucky for that. And I love that aspect of publicity and marketing, and the rest I can learn. I'll figure out how to hit my talking points. I need some media training. I think that would be really helpful. I'll have to bother my publicist a bit more about.
I don't think you need any media training, I'll be honest, but
well, as we get further, we get closer to when the book is actually out, maybe I'll take her up on some of those. She's like, "Are you sure you're good?" Sure. And I'm like, "Yeah, sure."
So that the publicist, I would say too, that the relationship with a publicist is also depending on where you're being published. Especially if it's a large publishing house, your publicist has a lot of different titles that they're working on, and their titles are all in different stages, right, at each point in the process. And so it is someone who is going to give you wonderful attention, of course, for a period of time, but also is being pulled in a million different directions. And it can be the relationship. As a former agent, it's the relationship that I would probably talk to my clients about the most, because I would want to make sure that the publicist was not being overwhelmed with questions about things that maybe we could get answered in another way, but also that the publicist was feeling or was staying on top of things, to be honest. So I don't know if either of you or any of the three of you have dealt with kind of those conversations about what, how often and how much do I communicate with people inside the publishing house, and how much am I kind of dealing with things in a different way? Is that making sense, what I'm saying? Like the sort of politics of communication? No?
I think that's kind of, where your editor can also be the lever, because you talked about it earlier, Becca, but they do play so many roles. And I think one that most people who aren't in publishing realize is that they kind of act as like the project manager, or I guess product manager, where they are literally like, as you said, shepherding this through and making sure everyone else is doing their jobs and supporting the book. So I think I always came back to my editor is like the person leading the charge. And if I trust her, then she's making sure everyone else is also doing the best that they can, because we are all in this together sort of mentality.
Yeah, that's smart. And having that main point person who is kind of invested in everybody getting what they need, and then of course, just everybody having good communication. Dalia, what about you in terms of publicity? Tell us about your experience.
I had a great experience. I felt like that the team at Deep Vellum is small, but they really came out in like a big way. And we started meeting similar to Jenny, maybe 6 to 8 months, 6 to 10 months out pretty regularly to talk about strategy. And I love Deep Vellum too. They're awesome. And I didn't actually expect that, especially going with a smaller house, that there was going to be like a book tour and all these things that ended up happening. But a lot of that was just like the publicity team and the publicist there, just connecting with opportunities and with booksellers. I also had some good practice. They took me to something called FallCon in Denver in October, which is basically where they pitched to a lot of booksellers. And I think that was just like mountain and plains, actually, booksellers. So it was really cool to get a sense of like all these indies thriving, and all these places, independent bookstores I'd never heard of, which is, awesome to get them on my radar, and also just to know, that they're doing this work out there. And just being able to follow up with booksellers, I think, was a really valuable thing as a writer. But similar to what we were talking about, just in terms of when Jenny was talking about her catapult essays, I was encouraged really early in the process with working with the publicist and the marketing team there to just get my byline out as much as possible. So I really shifted gears. I just, I think just working on a novel for a long time, I got really myopic about that. So my instinct was just to start working on the next novel so I could just like get that done. But I was encouraged to kind of take a step back and think about shorter pieces and getting my byline out. And the publicist was able to get me a contract to write craft capsules for poets and writers, which I really enjoyed. And then a few pieces that I had written were placed, and then a couple of interviews they were able to arrange. But I would say also, just in the lead up to doing these things and doing events, listening to podcasts, interviews with other writers was really helpful. A friend of mine does a podcast for Barnes and Noble called Poured Over that I listen to a lot. I mean, at first it was like loyalty and support, but I think it's a really wonderful podcast. And it's very useful to hear other writers talking about their books and their work and craft. At least I found it just, it was a good way to prepare myself to be out there talking about the book and getting my talking points down.
I love that idea, and just bringing up that other middle space, right? That period of time after the book is in the officially, you're not going to read any more copy edits. You're not like it's done. But there's still so much time between that usually and publication. What can you be doing? And often, yeah, the idea of doing pieces that can be off the book page, right? So that personal essays that are connected to what you've written and other ways that you can get your name out there, but also listening to writers and sort of modeling your own way of approaching talking about your work. So speaking of talking about your work, I meant to give you guys a heads up about this, but I didn't. So we're just going to do it. It's one of the things that you've probably had to think about a lot, right? Through this process. How do I answer that question? What is your book about? And tonight we've been talking about the path to publication, but I am so excited, especially as I'm going to go to the audience questions in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to give each of you the opportunity, especially as we think about encouraging folks to buy the books, to do our summer book club, to just tell folks what it is you've written. So give your sort of initial, I know this is terribly on the spot, but you can do it. I believe in all of you. Your initial sort of description for your novel. And we are going to start, Dalia, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to start back at the beginning.
I'll get it over with. I do feel like it's really devolved over time. It was much stronger at one point, and I don't know. We'll see how it goes tonight. No warning. I would say my book is basically about a young woman who witnesses a political revolution in Egypt in the 50s. It's really the end of the colonial era in Egypt, and it starts to make her question kind of everything in her life and the very sequestered life that she does have, and the choices that are being made for her by her very patriarchal father. And so it sparks basically a revolutionary instinct in her to flee Egypt with somebody that she barely knows. And the book follows multiple generations of this family and sort of the long arch of that decision.
Yeah. Great job. That's a great job. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful novel. All right. Country of origin, everyone. All right. Kimberly, you're up.
Yeah, how do you follow that? The Last Karankawas. So this is a novel that is told in a number of voices and stories, but at its heart is this community based in Galveston Island, Texas. And at the heart of that community is this young woman named Carly, who is a BOI. She was born on the island. She's lived there all her life. And according to her grandmother who raised her, she is a descendant of the Karankawa Indians, who were the indigenous people who populated the Texas coast, and until fairly recently were believed to have been extinct or died out or migrated away. And Carly is not very happy about that history because she wants nothing more than to uproot from the island and go anywhere else. And but there's a lot of things keeping her there, including her grandmother, including this history. And the book sort of looks at Carly and her grandmother and their close-knit circle of people in their neighborhood. And it bounces back and forth in time a bit. But at its core is 2008, the late summer of 2008, which is when Hurricane Ike hits Galveston, Texas, which is a real hurricane. And Carly and her community have to decide and make these choices of what to do when that happens. Do they stay? Do they go? Can they stay? Can they go?
See, no media training needed. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jenny, what do you
Oh my
got
gosh.
for us?
Okay, it's been a while since I've done this, so here we go. Okay, so Four Treasures of the Sky is about a young Chinese girl named Dai who is kidnapped from her home in China, shipped all the way across the ocean in a bucket of coal, and ends up in San Francisco to go to the brothels in Chinatown. And she manages to make her way over to Idaho, the American West. And it's about her trying to go all the way back home to China. It's set in 1882 to 1885-ish, so against the backdrop of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So not only is she, dealing with the land and just the challenges of the time, but also the significant racism and anti-Chinese violence that was rampant during that period. And it's about, art, identity, it's about calligraphy, it's about coming into your own, it's about names, all the things.
Thank you. Great. All three of these books, guys, so wonderful. And I hope that you'll join us in August for the book club, but we'll send you so much more information about that. I know Evan will drop the Book People link into the chat box again for you to be able to find the books. But I want to turn to some of the questions that have come in because I want to make sure that we get some of these answered. So we had a question very early on, and I think I don't think everyone, I think maybe everyone answered how long it took you until you were done in terms of your manuscripts, right? We sort of touched on that. Jenny, how about you? What did you say? Did you say it was a couple of years? Am I right? Or no, less?
So I think overall a couple of years, okay, 2 years maybe, but the writing, it was from April 2019 to, I sent it to my agent July 2020. So a little over a year. And then we edited for 1 month and then submitted to my, went on submission and got the offer like in 2 days. And so from the time when I sold the book to the time when I got edits back, maybe like 3 months. And then the editing revision process was from like October 2020 to March 2021. So I'm sorry if it's so clinical, but I just remember these dates exactly.
So like 2 years from start to finish, like
Yeah.
It sounds like. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Dalia, how about you? Start to finish.
It's a number I've avoided a lot. Well, now that I have the book out, I don't really care. For a long time, it was sort of just dragged me down, but it was a back burner project for obsession for like 15 years for me.
Yeah. Yeah. No shame in that. I mean, I've heard a lot of writers talk about multiple, and sometimes you move on to something else and then you keep going back to it because it's just, there's heart there, right? Thank you. Kim, how about you?
Well, hearing Dalia, that makes me feel better about mine. I would say mine, I wrote the bulk of the novel, like the real chunk of the manuscript, and probably over about 5 years, I think, before I submitted it to agents. But the very first story, which would be the title chapter, which is now the title chapter of the book, I wrote that in 2009, I think, 2009 or 9 or 10, and didn't touch it, after that for many years, and then came back to it many years later, and it ended up being really the core of the book. So a longer process, but I'd say the bulk of it was about 5 years.
Thank you. So here we go. I'm going to keep finding some questions. Were there any questions you got from agents in early stages that surprised you or were difficult to answer? And I'm guessing that is more in the sort of querying stage of things. So when you were looking for an agent to work with, did anyone ever surprise you maybe with a question about the project that didn't feel like you were ready to answer? A lot of folks are going to our conference next weekend and they're going to be pitching agents in person. So I think that this question is partly like, what kind of questions will agents ask me? So does anyone have any experience with that, whether it was pitching agents at some point, querying agents, talking to agents, just questions that they asked you that maybe other people would love to hear in preparation for what they're up against next weekend? No?
I know. And this came up for me when I was querying as well, just whether comp titles, which are so valuable and I think a really useful thing to lead with in a pitch, have to be pretty current. And I was told, and maybe you all can correct me, that it's better to have more recent books. I mean, for me, some of the books that inspired me were written like when I started my book, but it's to pull up, like titles that are a little bit older, I think aren't necessarily that useful in industry speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is something that comes up. And I think the frustrating thing with that too is that you don't always hear the same answer. So you might hear some people say, yes, it has to be. There are some publishers that require that the comp titles they use internally be within a certain amount of time frame. But then, you have a writer who finds the perfect comp and it's a few years outside of that. And how do you really tell them that's not the best comp because it's perfect, right? But did either of you any of you really wrestle with the comp titles?
I didn't really. I think I leaned contemporary just because I just assumed. I don't know if it was ever explicitly explained to me in that way. But I think there were a few times where if there was a specific comp title that felt very significant and had a lasting legacy, that really spoke to me. Like, for example, I think in a couple of query letters, I referenced The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, which has, never gone out of style really, and is not that contemporary anymore, but really speaks to aspects of my work. And so I included that a couple of times, and it felt, recognizable and instantly, able to be accessed by an agent, by an editor. But I was going to say another question that I got, I don't think it was a strange question. I think just I had never been asked it and hadn't really thought about it before, which was just, what are the limits of what you're willing to do to this book? And I think that mostly came around because of form, right? Like, so at the time my work was a collection of stories. And I think the agents were gently asking, like, if somebody wants you to make this a novel, like, will you put your foot down, and I hadn't really thought about that at that point. What are my limits? Where are they? And at what point am I able to say, like, no, I'm not comfortable with that? And I found that really helpful, and it was something I hadn't thought of before. And fortunately, I haven't ever asked to be tested to my limits yet, but it was something that I found useful to kind of think about when they asked.
Oh, I love it. So someone asked, did you ask members of your target audience to read parts or all of your manuscript before submitting it to agents or editors? And I did. I actually had sort of flagged in my mind when you mentioned beta readers, Jenny, earlier. Can you kind of all of you sort of speak to who your early readers were, how you find early readers, how you decide who you're going to share your stuff with before you're ready to start whatever process you start in terms of moving down the path to publication. And give tips on sort of thinking about that. Who would you share your writing with? Jenny, I'm looking at you because you said beta readers, right? Earlier back in the early part. Yeah.
I had 6 beta readers. So I wanted a nice variety. Again, I was just afraid I'm too close to this. I'm not seeing everything there needs to be seen. So I chose, I think 3 to 4 of my beta readers were writers. So writer friends from my MFA program at Wyoming, writer friends from the Tin House workshops that I did. And these were writers that, having been in workshop with them, I knew that they read my work the way that I wanted it to be read. And thus their feedback was going to only be helpful for me. And I trusted their feedback and their advice. So I had 4 writers, but then 3 to 4 writers, but then I also had people who weren't writers, right? You want people who aren't writers to be reading your book as well. So I had my best friend read it and I had my mom read it. And those were kind of my 2 gauges of these are also people that I care about and I care about their opinion. And I also know they would never lie to me and I trust them. So I think you need kind of a good variety of writers who can give you feedback, but also people who are not even in the writing world whatsoever.
That's great advice. How about you two, Dalia? Who were your early readers?
Well, I have this writing group that I've had for probably 5 or 6 years, and we trade a lot of work, and they saw this novel in its entirety a couple of times and also helped me. And I was trying to really just polish the beginning at a different time. But I agree with Jenny that it's also really helpful to have people who are not self-identified creative writers approach it just as readers, experience it as readers, and maybe not get caught up in some of the technical or craft types of details that our writer friends might. So similarly, my mom was a great fact checker, especially for all things Egypt and some of the historical and the sort of cultural details that I wanted to make sure were right, but also some friends that I trust their reading taste and their taste in books generally.
Yeah. Kim, how about you?
It's kind of a similar situation. So again, my book went through early drafting, revising, early manuscript drafting when it was my graduate school dissertation. So I was very fortunate that stories had been workshopped in classes before they even went to the dissertation. And then it was workshopped again by my really lovely and knowledgeable committee of professors, 2 of whom were creative writers and 1 who is a scholar of Latinx literature. So that was very helpful to have his eye on my creative work. But then outside of that, I have a very small group of trusted readers who are writers, mostly writers themselves. And I think in that way, it's, again, people who similar to Dalia and Jenny, people who will read my work and kind of understand what I'm getting at and have seen my work before. So maybe kind of know what some of my capabilities or some of my limitations and can challenge me on those in not just this book, but as part of, the other writing that I've done previously. And yeah, in retrospect, at no point did I offer this to my family. I'm trying to remember, at any point, offer for my parents to read it. No, I think they were just kind of like, okay, cool. You've written a book. When will we read it? And I was like, when it's published. And they were like, great.
You can buy it in the
but-
bookstore.
yeah, my dad has read it now, which is really helpful. And luckily has not critiqued me on it because it's too late to make changes. So, but no, I feel very fortunate that the trusted readers that I have are good readers, just of books, of a wide variety of tastes and styles, and I feel fortunate in that way. So I think that's a good strategy. Yeah.
That's the other one thing that can be a little fraught, right? You publish your book and then maybe you start to notice who in your world hasn't read it. Like, wait a minute. What do you,
Yeah.
I don't think you've read my novel.
Yeah.
Brother, cousin, aunt. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Well,
that's true.
I am sure we could sit here for much longer and talk about this process, but I am so aware of the time, and I am so thankful to the three of you for spending your evening here with us. And I just want to say again, congratulations. And I know, Kim, you're racing towards it in a couple of months. And of course, Jenny and Dalia, you're still in the thick of it, right? You've still got stuff going on. And but we're so excited to be able to be here at this moment with you, and also to read the books and come together in August. So thank you for being so generous with your time with us. And to everyone who's here tonight, thank you for being here. And thank you so much for spending your evening with us. For sure, pick up the books. Come back again in August. We'll send you lots of information about it. And I hope I'll see some of you this weekend at the conference, if not somewhere else sometime soon. So have a really great rest of your night, everyone. And good night.
Thank you, Becca.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It was fun.
Take care,
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here.